The night is still, almost too still. Somewhere far beyond the known world, a pale moon hangs over an unfamiliar shore, its reflection trembling in waters that no map has named. The air is heavy with the perfume of spices, their scents carried on a breeze that has crossed deserts, jungles, and oceans. And in the quiet, there is a sound, faint, rhythmic, the slow creak of masts that have sailed farther than any chronicler dared imagine. They say the Knights Templar vanished into the mists of history in the autumn of 1307, their fleet dissolving into silence from the harbor of La Rochelle. No battle, no wreckage, no witnesses who dared to speak. The chronicles simply stop. But what if the trail did not end in the cold waters of the Atlantic? What if it turned east, far east, past Africa's Horn, through the teeming ports of India, into the heart of seas no European had yet claimed? What if the crimson cross of the Templar sails was seen just once beneath the shadow of the Great Wall? It is an idea too vast to fit neatly into the pages of history, and perhaps that is why history does not record it. Yet in brittle archives of forgotten monasteries, in the fading embroidery of a robe kept in a Chinese temple, and in the half remembered stories of coastal villages along the South China Sea, there are traces, not proof, just fragments, enough to suggest that the greatest secret of the Templar order was not what they carried away from France, but where they went after. Tonight, let us follow that trail across half the world, through storms and silence, between truth and legend. Let the tide lift you from the stone docks of medieval France, past the salt-stung winds of Arabia, through the jeweled waters of the Indies, until, perhaps, you stand on a shore where East and West once met in secret. For if the Templars reached China, their voyage would not only rewrite the final chapter of their story, it might change the story of the world itself. And so we begin with sails and shadow, heading into a dawn no European had yet seen. Picture the world in the early years of the 14th century, a world vast, fragmented, and stitched together only by the thinnest threads of trade and rumor. In the West, Europe stirs uneasily after the last embers of the Crusades. The Holy Land is lost. The memory of Jerusalem now belongs more to prayers than to armies. France, England, and the kingdoms of Iberia brood over debts and shifting alliances, their monarchs sharpening both sword and tax quill. The church, bruised by politics and greed, clutches at its authority, while whispers of heresy coil through cloisters and marketplaces awake. And on one fateful October morning in 1307, those whispers turned into chains. The Knights Templar warriors, bankers, navigators were seized in a coordinated strike by King Philip IV. On land, they were broken. At sea, they were simply gone. To imagine where they might have gone, we must look east far beyond the edge of the maps that hung in any European hall, past the Pillars of Hercules, where the Atlantic breathes into the Mediterranean. A chain of sea routes extends down the coast of Africa, around the Red Sea, and into the teeming waters of the Indian Ocean. Here, dhows heavy with frankincense sailed alongside Chinese junks bearing porcelain and silk. The sea was a language understood by merchants from Hormuz to Calicut, from Sumatra to Canton. Further still lay the great Mongol Empire, now wearing the robes of the Yuan Dynasty in China by the reign of Emperor Temür Khan. The empire stretched from the frozen rivers of Siberia to the lush rice plains of the south. The Silk Road pulsed with caravans carrying not only goods, but ideas, Buddhist sutras alongside Venetian glass, Arabic medical texts alongside Chinese compasses. The Mongols had welcomed foreign merchants before. Marco Polo himself had walked their courts and returned to tell Europe of a world shimmering with wealth and order. But between La Rochelle and the harbors of China lay half a world of peril. The Templars, if they sailed, would have faced the winds of the Cape, the pirates of the Malabar coast, the monsoon's iron will. Yet they were no strangers to danger. Their fleets had run the gauntlet from Acre to Lisbon, carrying relics through waters thick with enemies. Somewhere in that vast stretch of ocean and empire, the possibility stirs that the Templar fleet found not only refuge, but a new purpose. that their red-crossed banners once brushed against the silk awnings of a Chinese port, exchanging not only gold for goods, but secrets for sanctuary. To follow this trail, we must map the world not as it was drawn in ink, but as it was known by those who lived upon it, a web of coastlines, currents, and silent agreements. For the Templars, the sea was never empty. It was a chessboard, and every harbor a move toward survival. And perhaps, just perhaps, their final move was played on the far side of the world. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, a name so humble it almost mocked the truth. For in their 2 centuries of existence, the Knights Templar had become far more than warrior monk. They were a nation without borders, an invisible empire bound not by land, but by oath. They began simply enough, as guardians of pilgrims in the dangerous roads of the Levant, but each year brought new privileges from popes and princes' lands in every corner of Christendom, exemption from taxes, freedom from local laws. They answered only to the pope, and often, it seemed, not even to him. By the mid 13th century, their white mantles crossed with red were known in every market and harbor from England to Antioch. The Templars had 2 faces. One was the knight in gleaming mail, mounted and ready to charge into Saracen lines. The other was quieter, harder to see the steward counting coin in a candlelit chamber, the sailor tightening a line in the dead of night, the envoy slipping into the court of a foreign king. Their archives, now mostly lost, once detailed a network so dense it could rival any royal chancery. In the ports of Marseille, La Rochelle, Lisbon, and Acre, their ships waited, often bearing no Templar insignia.
In the bustling bazaars of Damascus and Cairo, their agents dealt in spices, grain, and silks, moving goods with the same discipline they moved armies. They had learned Arabic from scholars, navigation from merchants of the Indian Ocean, and diplomacy from years of negotiating truces with Muslim rulers. It was this second face of the order pragmatic, worldly, and patient that might have plotted the kind of voyage whispered about in legend, for to cross from France to China in 1307 was not the dream of a romantic knight, but the calculation of a strategist. It would require a chain of safe ports, knowledge of foreign tongues, skill in the seasonal winds, and thus, perhaps most important, a cargo valuable enough to purchase not only passage, but protection in foreign courts. Some say the Templars fled France with gold and silver. Others believe they carried something rarer, sacred relics, manuscripts of forbidden knowledge, or navigational charts centuries ahead of their time.
Whatever the truth, it was clear they had something worth hiding, and if hiding it meant crossing oceans, the Templars with their silent fleet and far-flung allies could do it. They were not saints, nor were they simple soldiers. They were an order that understood both the sword and the ledger, the battlefield and the marketplace, and above all, they understood the sea, the one place where a king's reach could falter, where survival could be plotted on the wind. If the Templars reached China, it would be because they were never just knights. They were a brotherhood of the horizon, and their horizon may have been far wider than history dares to admit. Long before the Templars became the specter that haunted the dreams of kings, they were simply 9 men, 9 knights, weary from battle, who gathered in the year 11 in the newly captured city of Jerusalem. They swore an oath to protect pilgrims along the treacherous roads between the holy city and the coast roads, stalked by brigands, hostile militias, and worse, the cruel desert itself. The king of Jerusalem, Baldwin II, granted them quarters in a wing of the royal palace, built upon the site that tradition claimed to be the Temple of Solomon. It was from this sacred shadow that they took their name Pauperes, Commilitones, Christi Templic Salomonici, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The story of their first years is wrapped in the airless stillness of legend. 9 nights, it is said, spent not their days on the roads, but beneath the earth, digging in the vaults below the Temple Mount. Chroniclers gloss over this period with vague remarks about pious works and guarding the temple. But in later centuries, whispers would grow louder that the founding brothers had uncovered something beneath the ancient stones, something that would set their order apart forever. Some said they found the treasures of Solomon himself, chests of gold and silver hidden from Babylon's armies. Others claimed it was the Ark of the Covenant, its gilded frame humming with the power of God. Still others believed they found scrolls maps, prophecies, and engineering secrets from a forgotten age, written in tongues no man could yet read. From these uncertain beginnings, the Templars rose with astonishing speed. The Council of Troy in 1129 gave them official sanction. Pope Honorius II blessed their mission. Noble houses across Europe poured land and wealth into their hands. Within a single lifetime, the order had grown from 9 men to thousands, from a single lodging to a network of castles, farms, and commanderies spanning Christendom. And yet, the legends of their origins never faded. In the corners of monasteries and in the hushed backrooms of noble courts, tales spread that the Templars possessed a secret inheritance knowledge not given to other knights. Some believed they had inherited the wisdom of the Essenes, the Jewish sect that once lived in the Judean wilderness, guardians of mysteries older than Rome. Others whispered of a chain of contacts stretching even further east beyond Persia to lands where Buddhist monasteries preserved ancient maps of the world's oceans, and where navigators read the stars in ways unknown to the West. It is here that another current enters the story, the old maritime legends. Long before the Crusades, Mediterranean sailors told tales of distant lands reached by Phoenician traders. The Greeks had their own myths of ships that passed beyond the Red Sea to find gold in faraway Ophir, of Argonauts who sailed into unknown rivers that emptied into a foreign ocean. Among Arab navigators, stories spoke of islands in the eastern seas where spice grew wild and the waters glittered with pearls. These were not idle fancies. By the time the Templars were born, the Indian Ocean trade network was already ancient. From the coast of East Africa to the Straits of Malacca, merchants sailed with the monsoon winds, their routes known to the great ports of Hormuz, Calicut, and Canton. In these markets, a handful of Europeans, mostly Venetian or Genoese, had already begun to appear, their goods passing through Muslim and Mongol hands. The Templars, for all their martial fame, were not ignorant of this. They had been stationed in the Levant for decades, fighting alongside and negotiating with forces who had inherited these older sea routes. In Accra, they could have spoken with merchants from Yemen who had seen the temples of southern India, or with Chinese envoys whose silk bolts had traveled farther than any knight could ride. Some of the order's most obscure internal records fragments, preserved in later inventories, list goods of strange origin: cinnamomum from the land of Ceylon, cloth of gold from Cathay, pearls from the sea beyond the Indies. Such items did not arrive in Europe without long journeys and multiple exchanges. The simplest explanation is that the Templars, like other merchants of their day, bought these goods in Levantine markets. But among more speculative historians, another possibility remains: that the Templars maintained their own discrete network of agents, passing cargo eastward and westward in quiet defiance of the monopoly held by certain Italian city-states. And then there are the stranger legends. One, recorded in a Portuguese chronicle 2 centuries later, claims that a Templar captain named João de Monteiro sailed beyond the coasts of Africa, reaching a land of towers and dragons before returning with strange coins and porcelain bowls.
The chronicler's details are muddled, and most historians dismiss it as an invention written after Portugal's later voyages to the east, but its imagery towers, dragons, porcelain is unmistakably Chinese. Even within Europe, the Templars became linked in the popular imagination to hidden knowledge of navigation. Sailors along the Breton coast told of Red Cross ships that could sail against the wind, of charts marked with islands no one else could find, and in the back rooms of certain monasteries, copies of ancient Greek and Arabic texts on astronomy and geometry were said to rest beneath the Templars' seal, perhaps even knowledge of the magnetic compass, which had already been used in China for centuries. If the Templars truly intended to flee beyond the grasp of Philip IV in 1307, such legends take on a sharper edge. They would have needed more than courage. They would have needed routes, allies, and perhaps knowledge that predated their own founding. The myths of their origins, the relics under Solomon's temple, the secret scrolls, the whispered Eastern connections may have been exaggerations in peacetime, but in the moment of their greatest peril, those same whispers could have been transformed into a survival plan. The irony is that we may never know how much truth those early legends held. The French crown and the Inquisition ensured that most Templar archives were destroyed. What remains are hints scattered across languages and centuries, a half deciphered cargo list here, a monk's marginal note there, the carved symbol of a cross within a Chinese temple whose founding date is awkwardly close to the Templars' fall. The ancient origins of the order are therefore like the keel of a ship seen beneath deep water, just a shadow, a suggestion of form. Yet without that keel, the ship could not sail. Without those beginnings, real or imagined, the Templars would have been only another military order, easily crushed and forgotten. But they were not forgotten. Their beginnings were wrapped in stories that linked them not only to Jerusalem, but to a larger, older world. And if those origins held even a thread of truth, if in those first years beneath the Temple Mount they had found a map, a contact, or a key to routes unknown to other Europeans, then their disappearance in 1307 was not an end, but a continuation of a journey that had begun 2 centuries earlier. Perhaps the Red Cross was always meant to be seen in foreign waters. Perhaps the legends of the Templars' birth were in fact the first chapter of a story that would end or begin again on a distant shore where the dragons of China guarded gates of gold. If the early years of the Templars were shrouded in dust and rumor, their rise was carved in stone. By the mid 12th century, their white mantles with the red cross were a familiar sight on every road to the Holy Land. Their numbers had swelled from 9 brothers to hundreds, then to thousands, and their holdings, once a few gifts of land from pious nobles, now stretched from the olive groves of Provence to the green hills of England, from the vineyards of Cyprus to the rugged shores of Portugal. They became something unusual in the medieval world, a brotherhood that was both holy and practical, devoted to God, yet relentlessly efficient in managing their earthly affairs. Each commandery, a Templar estate, or fortress was a self-contained engine of survival. Fields were tilled by lay workers, mills ground grain, forges shaped weapons, stables bred horses, and above it all, the Templars kept records, neat columns of figures in ink, noting every coin, every sack of flour, every shipment of wool or wine. From this base of land and discipline grew their greatest power wealth, but not wealth in the crude sense of piles of gold locked in chests. The Templars' wealth was fluid. They became bankers before the word had taken on its modern meaning. A pilgrim in Paris could deposit his money at a Templar house and receive a coded letter of credit, redeemable in Jerusalem. Kings did the same. Even monarchs who never rode to war in the East trusted the Templars to guard their treasures. In the bustling ports of the Mediterranean, this trust was matched by a growing fleet. The order's ships were not the lumbering cogs of peasant traders, nor the gaudy galleys of the great Italian republics. They were sleek, seaworthy, and when needed fast enough to outrun pirates or royal patrols, their hulls carried not only pilgrims and supplies for the Crusades, but goods for trade spices, cloth, timber, and some whispered, rarer cargoes whose names were never entered into any ledger. The Templars' rise was also aided by their unique political position. They owed allegiance to no king, only to the Pope and popes, grateful for their service in the Crusades, granted them extraordinary privileges. They were exempt from local taxes, immune from the jurisdiction of bishops, and free to move goods across borders without paying tolls. In an age when every lord tried to squeeze coin from passing merchants, such freedom was a golden key. It is easy now to see how this web of privileges, lands, and ships could have become the skeleton of something more, a network that could stretch across continents if needed. By the late 13th century, the Templars had ports in France, England, and Iberia, connections in the Levant and Cyprus, and contacts with merchants from North Africa, Arabia, and even the fringes of Asia. They had learned the rhythms of the sea, the long reach of the summer winds, the treacherous gales of winter, the great invisible rivers of current that could carry a ship farther than its captain dared dream. They had also learned the art of discretion. Many of their ships sailed under neutral or even false flags, blending with the convoys of Genoa, Venice, or Catalonia. This was not merely a trick to avoid hostile patrols, it was a way to keep their movements hidden from rival merchants and, if necessary, from the eyes of kings. Yet power, like the tide, invites danger. As the Holy Land slipped from Christian hands with the fall of Acre in 1291, marking the final blow, the Templars' original mission began to fade. No longer were they the spear point of crusading armies. They still maintained fortresses, but their military purpose grew less clear. Their economic might, however, remained, and it was this that began to draw envy and suspicion. In France, King Philip IV had emptied his treasury with wars against England and of Flanders. The Templars had lent him money before. Now he wanted more, much more. When they refused, he saw not only a creditor, but a rival. An order of knights who commanded both wealth and loyalty across his realm, and who answered to a higher power in Rome. The seeds of destruction were sown. But the Templars' rise had given them something else, the means to escape. They knew how to move large sums without coin ever changing hands. They knew how to provision ships quietly, how to disappear into friendly ports, how to leave no paper trail, and perhaps most importantly, they had the habit born of centuries of war of always preparing for retreat. For a knight on the battlefield, survival often depended on knowing when to charge and when to withdraw. For the Templars as an order, the same was true. By 1307, they had faced defeat before in Edessa, in Jerusalem, in Acre. Each time, they had salvaged what they could and rebuilt elsewhere. Swear. What was France to them, except one more battlefield to quit when the odds turned? And so, when Philip struck on that October dawn, seizing the order's leaders and confiscating their lands, the Templars' rise to power had already given them their escape route. La Rochelle was no accident. It was one of their best ports, deep-watered and well-supplied, with crews who owed their allegiance to the order alone. From there, the sea stretched west to the Atlantic and around it, to any corner of the world. The same fleet that had carried them to war in the east could now carry them away from the west. The same secrecy that had hidden their trade routes from rivals could now hide their retreat from the crown, and the same web of contacts, merchants, sailors, and allies in distant lands could offer them shelter far from the reach of France or Rome. By the time the last torch was lit in the streets of Paris, some of their ships may have already been far beyond sight of France.
The question is not whether they had the means to flee they did, but where they chose to go. If their rise had taught them anything, it was that survival lay not in clinging to what was lost, but in reaching for what lay beyond the horizon. And perhaps, just perhaps, their final horizon was not in Europe at all, but in the eastern seas where the spices were sweet, the harbors vast, and the dragons of China watched over treasures that no French king could ever touch. There is a point in every tide when the water lies fullest against the shore, a moment of quiet majesty before the pull began. For the Templars, that high tide came in the decades before the fall of Acre, when their coffers were full, their ships swift, and their banner feared and respected in equal measure. It is tempting to picture them only as warriors in white mantles, charging into the dust of battle, yet the true heart of their golden age lay in the rhythm of their wider world, the creak of wagon wheels delivering grain to their granaries in Champagne, the ring of blacksmiths forging horseshoes in Cyprus, the slap of waves against the hulls of their galleys in Lisbon, Marseille, and La Rochelle, from the cold coasts of Scotland to the date-laden shores of the Levant. The Templar network was a living thing, a chain of strongholds, ports, sommet, and estates bound by trust, secrecy, and the constant movement of goods and information. At its center stood not a single capital, but 100 beating hearts, commanderies in every land where their seal hung above the door, their walls thick with stored grain, coin, arms, and parchment. Their ships were the arteries of this vast body, sleek, narrow-hulled vessels for swift passage, broader cogs for heavy cargo, armed galleys ready to deter pirates.
They carried pilgrims eastward and returning merchants westward, their decks laden with bales of wool, barrels of wine, sacks of sugar and salt, and somewhere in the deep shadows of their holds there might be a locked chest or two, contents known only to the commander and his god. Unlike the fleets of kings, which served the ambitions of a single ruler, the Templar navy answered to a council. This made it flexible, able to respond quickly to crises, to shift cargo or men where they were needed most. And unlike the merchant fleets of Venice or Genoa, Templar ships were not purely commercial. They could and often did sail for reasons never entered in any cargo list. In their golden age, the Templars also became masters of diplomacy. They knew when to fight and when to deal. Their envoys sat at the tables of Muslim sultans as well as Christian kings, trading hostages, arranging truces, and sometimes quietly exchanging gifts that crossed not only borders but faiths.
It was whispered that in the courts of Cairo and Damascus, the Templars were respected for their word and feared for the long reach of their vengeance if that word was broken. It is here that the possibility of their eastern reach begins to take shape, for while most of their recorded dealings lay within the Mediterranean and the Levant, there were threads that stretched further. Templar ports saw ships from as far as Yemen, where frankincense caravans ended and Indian Ocean dhows began their journeys. And in the markets of Acre before its fall, one could buy silk from Cathay, tea from distant mountains, and porcelain painted with the curling forms of dragons' goods that had crossed the entire breadth of Asia, carried by Muslim, Mongol, and Chinese merchants along the great caravan roads and across the sea lanes of the East. In this era, the Yuan Dynasty ruled China under Mongol emperors. The empire's ports were open to foreign traders. Arab merchants were welcome in Quanzhou and Guangzhou, and through these intermediaries, goods and sometimes knowledge made their way west. It is not impossible that the Templars, through their own merchant contacts, came into possession of charts, compasses, or knowledge of routes that stretched far beyond the limits of European maps. Their wealth in this period was staggering by medieval standards. Entire provinces in France, England, and Spain paid rents to Templar estates. Their treasuries funded not only fortresses in the Holy Land, but great building projects in Europe round churches modeled on the Holy Sepulchre, bridges, mills, and hospices. This wealth gave them a freedom few could claim. They could plan voyages not for profit alone, but for purpose to seek out allies, to secure far off refuges, or to guard treasures too dangerous to leave in one place. The order's discipline also reached its zenith in these years. Their rule was strict vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Yet within those vows lay a pragmatic spirit. A Templar knight could ride from London to Acre and find food, lodging, and a welcome at every commandery along the way. Orders could be sent from Paris to Cyprus and acted upon within weeks, a speed remarkable for the age. Such coordination was vital not only for war, but for any long voyage across uncertain seas. But the most telling feature of their golden age was their independence. They stood apart from kings and lords, owing allegiance only to the Pope, and even that bond, at times, seemed more a partnership than a subordination. In some regions, they were more powerful than local rulers, able to field armies, negotiate treaties, and lend money on their own terms. This independence was their strength, and it would become the reason they were destroyed. For kings do not tolerate rivals, and in France, Philip IV's debts to the Templars grew into resentment. Yet, before the storm broke, the order may already have sensed that their golden age could not last forever. Their history had taught them the fragility of strongholds, Jerusalem lost, Acre lost, castles burned or abandoned when the tide turned. It is possible that in these years of plenty, they began to prepare for the day when Europe itself might become hostile ground. Some historians believe that this is when the Templars began quietly mapping out sanctuary routes, chains of ports, and safe harbors that could carry them far beyond the reach of any European crown. Some of these led west, toward the New World that would not be discovered by Europeans for 2 centuries more. Others perhaps pointed east toward the riches and safety of the distant Orient. If so, their golden age was not only a time of wealth and honor, but of planning.
The gleam of their armor, the grandeur of their fortresses, and the power of their fleets may have hidden a quieter truth that the Templars were already thinking like exiles, ready to slip away if the tide turned, as it had so many times before. And when the tide did turn in 1307, perhaps they were ready, ready to let the Golden Age end in Europe and to begin another one, somewhere across the edge of the known world, where silk rustled in the wind and the air was sweet with spices. Every golden age casts its own shadows. For the Templars, the brilliance of their power began to attract not only admiration, but suspicion. Kings who once depended on their swords now envied their coffers. Merchants who once partnered with their fleets began to see them as rivals. And in the quiet corridor of cathedrals, whispers of heresy and greed began to gather like storm clouds. Their independence, the very thing that had made them so effective, was also what made them dangerous in the eyes of monarchs. They owed allegiance to no king. They kept their own records, guarded their own wealth, and answered only to the Pope. In a medieval world where royal authority was often fragile, the idea of a disciplined, wealthy transnational order was unsettling. Nowhere was this more true than in France. King Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair for his handsome features, but feared for his cold and calculating nature, had fought costly wars against England and Flanders. His treasury was drained, his debts deep. The Templars, who had often served as royal bankers, were among his largest creditors. To Philip, this was more than a financial problem, it was a political threat. The Templars' wealth was beyond his reach, and their loyalty was not guaranteed. The Pope, too, was under Philip's shadow. Clement V, a Frenchman, owed his position in part to the king's influence. The papacy itself had moved from Rome to Avignon, placing it uncomfortably close to Philip's court. Under these pressures, even the Pope's protection of the Templars began to weaken. It was not just politics. The Templars had enemies in the marketplace as well. The great maritime republics Venice, Genoa, Pisa viewed the order's fleets as competitors. These city-states dominated Mediterranean trade, and the Templars' ships, moving under the protection of papal privileges, often sailed toll-free and untaxed. Rumors began to circulate in merchant circles that the Templars smuggled goods, that they carried contraband, that their voyages were not always what they seemed. In the east, the fall of Acre in 1291 had been a bitter blow. The Templars' last great fortress in the Holy Land was gone. They retreated first to Cyprus, but the island was a poor substitute for the Levantine mainland. Without the Crusades, their military purpose was less clear, and their critics were quick to ask why an army without a battlefield should still command such wealth and power. Whispers of heresy soon followed. Some said the Templars worshipped a mysterious idol called Baphomet, a name whose origin remains uncertain. Others claimed they denied Christ, spat upon the cross, or engaged in secret rites behind closed doors. Many of these accusations were absurd, born of envy and ignorance. Yet in an age when the line between rumor and truth was thin, such tales could be deadly. Philip's agents gathered these whispers, wove them into a net of accusations, and waited for the moment to strike. That moment came on Friday, October 13th, 1307. At dawn, Templar houses across France were surrounded. Knights were arrested, their goods seized, their leaders dragged in chains before royal officers. The charges were heresy, blasphemy, corruption. Torture wrung out confessions. Many later recanted, but the damage was done. The Pope, under pressure, issued orders for other kingdom to follow France's example. Yet not all the order's assets could be seized so easily. The Templars had learned over generations how to protect their wealth. Gold could be hidden, moved, or transformed into goods less easily recognized. Ships could sail under foreign flags. Cargo could be transferred at sea. And so, in the chaos of those October days, a question was already being whispered. What of the fleet La Rochelle on the western coast of France was one of their most important ports, deep, defensible, and connected to the Atlantic trade routes? It was here that the Templar ships were last seen. Contemporary records are silent on their fate. Some claim they slipped away in the night before the arrests began. Others believe they had sailed weeks earlier, carrying not just treasure, but brothers who would never set foot in France again.
Where could they go? The obvious answer was Scotland, one of the few realms then at odds with the papacy and France. Another was Portugal, whose king had long been friendly to the Templars. But among the stranger possibilities whispered by later chroniclers was this, that some ships turned not north or west, but east, rounding the coast of Africa, aiming for ports where no French king could touch them. It is here that the intrigues deepen, for if the Templars truly sailed east, they would have needed more than a desperate impulse. They would have needed charts, contacts, and assurances of safe harbor. Such arrangements could not be made in a single night. They would have required years, perhaps decades of quiet preparation.
Could it be that the Templars, sensing the gathering storm in Europe, had already laid the groundwork for such a journey? Could their trading missions in the eastern Mediterranean have been the first steps in building a chain of allies stretching toward the Indian Ocean and beyond? One tantalizing fragment survives in a later inventory of goods seized from a Templar house in Marseille. Among the usual lists of arms, armor, and furniture is a mention of nautical instruments of foreign design and a chart of the Sea of Cathay. The authenticity of this document is debated, but if genuine, it suggests that knowledge of the Far Eastern seas was at least present in the order's holdings before their fall. In the years leading to 1307, the Templars also seem to have increased their presence in certain ports that were gateways to the east. Rhodes, Crete, and Cyprus Islands, positioned like stepping stones toward the Levant and beyond, saw heightened Templar activity.
Ships came and went under the cover of routine trade, but perhaps their true purpose was something else entirely. Conflicts and intrigues had placed the order in a tightening vice, a king's ambition on one side, a pope's compromised will on the other. But the sea, as it had so often in their history, offered another path, a path that could lead them not just to safety, but to reinvention in a land where their name meant nothing and their past could be set aside like a cloak at the door. And so, when the walls began to close in, perhaps some among the Templar leadership looked not to Scotland, not to Portugal, but to the horizon of the rising sun. The morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307 broke with no omen in the sky, no comet, no blood-red dawn, just the cool air of early autumn, the faint smell of wood smoke drifting over the streets of Paris, and the muffled sounds of the city waking. The bells of the churches rang the hour. Merchants lifted the shutters from their stalls, and somewhere in the stone halls of the Templar commandery, the brothers of the temple said their prayers. They did not know that their world was already ending across France, from Paris to the coast, from the valleys of the Loire to the salt flats of La Rochelle. The king's orders had gone out in secret, carried by trusted riders, sealed with the royal crest. Each letter commanded the same arrest every Templar at dawn. Seize their goods, hold them without question, and do not let a single one escape. The strike was sudden and absolute. In Paris, the king's men surrounded the temple's fortified compound, battering down its gates. Brothers were dragged from their beds, some still in their nightclothes, bound in chains before they could speak a word. In smaller towns, the same scene played out: the sudden knock at the door, the armed men, the shouts, the shock, the charges, read aloud in the squares, were shocking heresy, blasphemy, corruption, secret idol worship. The accusations were as lurid as they were implausible, but in the age of the Inquisition, they were enough to strip a man of his name before he even stood trial. Torture followed. Confessions were extracted, some whispered through broken teeth, others screamed aloud and later recanted when the pressure eased. But the damage to the order's reputation was done. Yet even as this net closed over their lands, there was one place where the king's hand did not reach in time: the sea at La Rochelle. The Templars maintained one of their most important ports. The harbor was deep and sheltered, with strong stone quays and warehouses stocked with supplies. In the days before the arrests, something stirred there: quiet, deliberate, purposeful. Ships were provisioned, sails were checked, barrels of water and wine, sacks of grain, crates of goods were loaded aboard. There is no surviving record of the fleet's departure, but chroniclers writing decades later claim that on the night before the arrests, the ships of the temple slipped their moorings and sailed into the dark. How many ships? Accounts vary. Some say a dozen, others fewer, others more. Where did they go? That is the heart of the mystery. Some believe they made for Portugal, where King Denis was a friend to the order and would later absorb many of its members into a new brotherhood. Others suggest Scotland, whose king was at odds with both Pope and France. But there is another, stranger possibility: that the fleet turned south, skirting the coast of Africa, seeking the sea routes known to Arab and Indian merchants, passing through the gates of the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean itself. From there, they could reach ports in India And perhaps if the wind and the will held the fabled harbors of China for such a voyage, the Templars would have needed more than courage. They would have needed charts, knowledge of the monsoon winds, contacts in foreign ports, and perhaps they had all three. Their years in the Levant had brought them into contact with traders from every corner of the known world. They had seen the silks, porcelains, and spices that came from lands far beyond Persia, and some among them may have dreamed of finding those lands themselves. If they fled toward China, their timing was as perfect as it was desperate. The Yuan Dynasty still ruled under Mongol emperors, and the great port cities of the south were open to foreign merchants. Arab traders had been doing business there for centuries. A fleet arriving under unfamiliar flags might have passed as just another band of Western merchants, seeking trade, not a hunted order, seeking refuge. We will never know exactly what was said in the councils of the order in those last nights before the arrest.
Perhaps the Grand Master Jacques de Molay, caught in Paris, never imagined such a voyage. Perhaps it was the commanders at La Rochelle, realizing their brethren were already lost, who decided that the fleet must vanish entirely, or perhaps the plan had been in place for months, even years, the final move in a game played quietly under the noses of kings. What we do know is this:
When the sun rose over La Rochelle on October 13th, the Templar ships were no longer in the harbor. They had gone with the tide, carrying with them whatever treasures, secrets, or men the order had chosen to save, and from that moment they were never seen in France again. The arrests marked the end of the Templars in Europe. Trials followed, slow and merciless truths, torture, burnings, confiscations. In 1314, Jacques de Molay himself was burned at the stake on the Ile de la Cité in Paris, protesting the innocence of the order with his final breath.
The Templar lands were handed to their rivals, the Knights Hospitaller. Their name was stricken from the rolls of honor, but the sea keeps its own counsel. What became of the fleet remains one of the great unanswered questions of medieval history. Did they truly vanish into the mists of the Atlantic? Did they find haven in friendly ports? Or did they follow the curve of the world to a place where French law could not touch them, a place where their white mantles with the red cross would mean nothing and everything, all at once? If they did, the events of that October morning were not only the destruction of the order, but its transformation, the turning point where knights became wanderers, where guardians of the temple became ghosts upon the sea, and somewhere far beyond the reach of Europe's kings, those ghosts may have found new shores, shores where dragons carved in stone guarded the gates, and the air was heavy with the scent of tea and cinnamon.
History, like the sea, rarely gives up all its secrets at once. The trail of the Templars' vanished fleet is no straight line across the map, but a scattering of glimmers in the dark flashes of light that might be stars or might be something else entirely. The first glimmer lies in an unexpected place, a temple on the coast of Fujian province, China. Local records date its founding to the early 14th century, the very decade when the Templars vanished from Europe. Within the temple's outer gate, carved into the stone above an alcove, is a cross, not the slender form of the Christian crucifix, but a thick armed, equal armed cross, its limbs flaring at the ends in a style strangely similar to the Templar cross pate. Chinese scholars who have studied the carving note that it does not match the symbols of the Nestorian Christians known to have reached China earlier under the Mongols, nor does it resemble Buddhist or Taoist iconography. It is an anomaly, unexplained in the temple's surviving records. Could it be coincidence? Possibly. The human mind is quick to see patterns, to trace familiar shapes in unfamiliar stone, yet for those who know the Templars' history, the resemblance is enough to stir the imagination. A second clue comes not in stone, but in cloth. In the private collection of a monastery in southern China lies a robe of deep crimson silk, embroidered with golden thread. The design is intricate dragons curling among clouds, waves breaking upon unseen shores, but on the inner lining, almost hidden in the folds, is stitched a small white shield with a red cross. It is unlike the heraldry of any Chinese clan. The monastery's records say only that the robe was gifted by foreign warriors who came from the Great Sea in the time of the Yuan. Then there is the matter of the coins. In a small fishing village along the coast of Vietnam, far from any major trade port of the period, Divers recovered from the sand a handful of silver coins corroded by centuries in salt water. Two of them are unmistakably European in origin, minted in France during the late 13th century, bearing the faint image of a cross and the name of King Philip IV. How they came to rest in those waters is a mystery. Vietnamese fishermen traded with Chinese merchants, yes, but European silver of that mint rarely traveled so far in those days, unless carried by human hands across great distances. In the archives of an old trading family in Calicut, India, lies another fragment, a shipping ledger from the early 1300s, written in a mix of Arabic and Malayalam. One entry describes a fleet of pale faced warriors who arrived from the far west carrying wool, wine, and strange weapons of fine steel. The ledger notes that they stayed only briefly, then sailed east, following the compass, toward lands beyond the rising sun. The description is vague, perhaps too vague, but the timing is suggestive. And then there are the stories. In the coastal villages of Hainan Island, elders tell of foreign sailors who came generations ago, wearing white garments marked with red. They traded metal goods and wine for food and water, and left before the moon had turned. The details are hazy as they often are when passed down in the oral tradition, but in one version of the tale, the strangers returned the following year, bearing gifts of silk, porcelain, and tea, as if sealing some pact with the villagers. More puzzling still is a scrap of parchment in a private European collection, its provenance uncertain. It is a map, or rather, a fragment of one showing the coastlines of India and Southeast Asia with surprising accuracy for its time. In one corner, near the place where southern China's coast might be drawn, is a small red cross. There are no labels, no compass rose, only the jagged lines of land and sea. And that solitary mark, could it have been made by a Templar hand, or is it the work of a later cartographer inspired by their legend? Skeptics argue that each of these clues can be explained in other ways. Cross like designs are not unique to the Templars. Coins travel far in trade. Oral traditions adapt and absorb outsiders into their own myths. And they are right. None of this proves that the Templars reached China, but together, the clues form a constellation that is difficult to ignore. If nothing else, they reveal the porousness of the medieval world. We imagine the centuries before the age of exploration is closed, provincial, bounded by ignorance. Yet the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean were already ancient.
Arab dhows, Chinese junks, Indian catamarans all moved goods, people, and ideas across thousands of miles. Into this web of trade and travel, the Templars could have inserted themselves, quietly and without fanfare, their white mantles packed away, their ships indistinguishable from any other. And perhaps that is why the traces are so faint. If the Templars truly sailed east, they may have chosen to leave no mark, to be remembered only in whispers and symbols hidden in the folds of other people's stories. For an order hunted across Europe, anonymity would have been the surest armor. Still, when one stands in the shadow of that Fujian temple, looking up at the strange cross carved into the stone, or when one holds the crimson robe, feeling the hidden embroidery beneath the silk, it is hard not to wonder, could these be the last scattered footprints of the knights who vanished from La Rochelle? Could they be the final chapter in a story that began in the dusty streets of Jerusalem, passed through the battlefields of the Crusades, and ended or began again under the watchful eyes of the dragons of China? History tells us the end of the Templars was swift, brutal, and complete. On parchment, it is written in decrees and trial records. In the chronicles, it is a tale of arrests, torture, and executions. But when one reads between those lines, there is a silence, a gap where something might have slipped away, unseen. After that October morning in 1307, France's prison swelled with the captured knights. Many were men who had never drawn a sword in years, old now, their hands calloused from estate work, not war. Others were commanders and brothers from the countryside, dragged from their commanderies under guard. Interrogations followed, laced with threats, fire, and iron. Confessions were wrung out, then retracted, then wrung out again. The charges heresy, blasphemy, idolatry clung to them like smoke, impossible to wash away. King Philip moved quickly to seize their lands, filling his treasury with the order's confiscated gold and silver. The Pope, cornered by the king's influence, issued a papal bull ordering all Christian monarchs to arrest the Templars within their realms. In many places, the arrests were carried out. In others, notably Portugal, Scotland, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, the orders were quietly ignored or fulfilled only in part. But in the official record, one thing is missing: the fate of the fleet. La Rochelle's ships, the pride of the Templar maritime network, were never inventoried among the seized assets. Not a single vessel appears in the king's lists of confiscated goods. No crewmen were recorded as captured in port. It is as though the fleet had never existed at all.
Some chroniclers, writing years later, claim the ships had sailed before the arrests, taking with them a fortune in gold, relics, and sacred texts. Others claim they had headed north to Scotland, where Robert the Bruce was already in open defiance of the Pope. Still others whispered of a longer journey toward lands no European king could claim, where a brotherhood could survive in secret. By 1312, the papal decree formally dissolved the order. The Knights Hospitaller inherited most of their European properties. Some Templars joined other orders, others retired quietly, still others vanished into obscurity. And yet, there is a curious absence of closure. Unlike other dissolved institutions, the Templars left behind no central archive, no last will of the order, no definitive list of their members' fates. This absence is where the legends breathe. It is here that the imagination finds room to sail. If we accept the possibility that the fleet escaped, then the fall of the Templars in Europe was not an ending, but a transformation. Those ships could have carried not only men and wealth, but the intangible heart of the order, its rituals, its symbols, its network of trust. In the holds could have been relics from the Holy Land, rare manuscripts, navigational tools unknown to other Europeans. The question is not whether they could have made such a journey. Their maritime skill and global contacts make that plausible, but whether they did. And here, the faint clues from the east take on a new weight. Imagine this as France burned their brothers at the stake. A handful of white mantled knights stood on the deck of a ship far from home, the smell of salt and spice in the air. Ahead lay a coastline unlike any they had seen, mountains rising like the spines of dragons, rivers glinting in the morning light. Behind them, Europe was gone. Ahead of them, perhaps, was survival.
Would they have revealed themselves as Templars in such a land? Almost certainly not. They would have arrived as merchants, bearing goods of value to the Yuan Dynasty's officials: wine, fine wool, silver, perhaps even European horses. In exchange, they might have sought only a place to remain, to rebuild their lives, to protect whatever it was they had carried from La Rochelle. Over time, they could have blended into the mosaic of foreign traders already present in China's southern ports: Arabs, Persians, Indians. Their strange armor might have been melted down, their red crosses folded away. And yet, in certain moments, a gift to a temple, a carving in stone, a whispered tale to a local ally, traces of their identity might have lingered. Back in Europe, their absence was explained away as annihilation. To the chroniclers of France and Rome, the Templars were gone, erased by the will of king and pope.
But in the quiet spaces beyond the reach of their quills, the order's story may have gone on. Unrecorded, it is the nature of disappearance to invite stories. The longer the gap, the more stories rush in to fill it. The Templars, with their wealth, secrecy, and sudden vanishing, provided the perfect seedbed for such tales. Some are fanciful, others perhaps carry a grain of truth. The image of their ships slipping away from La Rochelle into the vastness of the ocean is too potent to die. And so, the fall of the Templars may not have been a fall at all, only a turning of the tide. In Europe, the tide went out, leaving only wreckage, but far away, on another shore, it may have risen again, carrying the order into a new chapter we can only glimpse through scattered clues and fragile whispers. If so, then their disappearance was not the end of a brotherhood, but the rebirth of it in a place where their past could be hidden and their survival assured. And perhaps in the quiet courtyards of some ancient Chinese port, the echo of their footsteps still lingers, faint beneath the shuffle of centuries. The great paradox of the Templars is as that though their European chapter ended in fire and condemnation, their name has never truly vanished. In the official histories, their order dissolved in 13. In the popular imagination, it has never stopped sailing. If the fleet that slipped from La Rochelle did indeed reach the Far East, its legacy would not be a fortress or a banner. Such things cannot survive far from their homeland without drawing unwelcome eyes. It would be something subtler, folded into the lives and landscapes of another world. Perhaps it began with skills. The Templars were masters of fortification, and their designs had evolved over decades of defending the Holy Land. It is tempting to wonder whether a fortress on the Chinese coast or a storehouse on the Pearl River might, in some quiet way, carry echoes of their geometry, the angled walls, the round towers, the concealed water cisterns, not in overt imitation, but in whispered adaptation, a local craftsman taking inspiration from a foreign advisor who spoke little of his past. Their influence could also have lived on in the tools they carried. The medieval compass was already known in China, but European astrolabes with their intricate brass discs were rare. A surviving example in a private collection in Guangzhou bears markings in Latin as well as Chinese, its provenance unexplained. Was it a gift from an itinerant merchant knight, exchanged for safe passage or goodwill? Trade itself may have been their most enduring legacy. If the Templars settled, even briefly, in the ports of the Yuan Dynasty, they would have learned the ways of Chinese merchants, the art of negotiating with tea houses and guilds, the flow of goods from inland provinces to the coast. Such knowledge, if later carried west, could have subtly influenced the reopening of Europe's maritime ambitions centuries later. Perhaps some fragment of their sea routes, recorded in a private chart, survived in the archives of a Portuguese navigator or an Italian mapmaker. There are stranger hints. In certain Hokkien folktales, foreign warriors in white are said to have taught a coastal community how to reinforce their fishing boats with a particular pattern of iron nails, a technique that, according to modern historians, bears striking similarity to medieval European shipbuilding. The tale gives no names, only calling them Hai Angenlang, men of the sea wind. And then there is the matter of the cross. Equal armed, flaring at the tips, it appears in places where its presence is difficult to explain, carved into the lintel of a storage house in Quanzhou, scratched into the wall of a cave on Hainan Island, woven into the border of a ceremonial banner kept in a temple far inland. Chinese historians tend to see it as a foreign merchant's mark, a personal emblem, or a stylized flower. But for those who know the Templar cross, the resemblance is hard to ignore. Back in Europe, the legacy took another shape. The dissolution of the order scattered its surviving members. Some joined the Hospitalier of the Teutonic Knights, others faded into civilian life. Yet in Portugal, King Denis reconstituted the Templars as the Order of Christ, preserving much of their maritime knowledge. This order would later sponsor voyages that expanded the edges of the known world, voyages that some say drew on charts and routes that were older than the age of exploration itself. In Scotland, legends tell of Templar knights fighting alongside Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn in 1314, their sudden appearance turning the tide of battle. While historians debate the truth of this, the persistence of the tale speaks to the idea that the Templars survived in some hidden form as an unseen hand in the affairs of nations. If some of their brethren had indeed found refuge in the East, their legacy might have returned to Europe not in a single dramatic moment, but as a slow seep of knowledge, better ship designs, improved fortifications, awareness of the wider world's geography. These could have passed through the centuries disguised as the fruits of ordinary trade, their true origin forgotten even by those who used them. The most enduring legacy, however, may be the mystery itself. For 7 centuries, Baud, the story of the Templars' disappearance has fed the human appetite for the unknown. It has kept alive the image of a brotherhood unbroken by persecution, cunning enough to vanish from under a king's gaze, bold enough to sail into the unmapped corners of the world. In this way, the Templar's legacy is like the wake of a ship on the open sea. It does not point to the vessel itself, the ship is long gone, beyond the horizon, but it proves that something passed this way. And just as the wake fades, the mind begins to imagine where the ship has gone, what new shores it might now touch. In China, perhaps there is a small village where a family still tells the story of pale skinned strangers who arrived with iron tools and sailed away with tea and silk. In Portugal, perhaps there is an old chart locked away in a chest, its edges browned by age, showing a coastline that should not have been known for another 200 years. In Scotland, perhaps there is a gravestone in a windswept churchyard, its carving worn by rain, yet still bearing the faint outline of a cross pate. These are not monuments or grand histories, they are fragments as elusive and shifting as the sea mist. And yet, together, they form the true legacy of the Templars. If they indeed reached the Far East, not power or empire, but a presence felt in the margins of history, a whisper that refuses to die. For some legacies are built not on what is recorded, but on what is remembered, without proof on the questions that linger after all answers have been lost. And so, whether their final chapter was written in the ports of China or in the prisons of France, the Templars remain with us, in stone, in story, in the half light between fact and legend. They sail still. The centuries have not stilled the waters around the vanished fleet. If anything, time has only deepened the intrigue.
The story of the Templars' disappearance has become a magnet, drawing to it historians, amateur sleuths, treasure hunters, and dreamers alike. Each arrives with their own lantern, seeking to throw light on the shadows, and each leaves with a different vision of what might lie beyond the horizon. Among academic historians, the majority remain cautious. They acknowledge that the fate of the fleet is undocumented, but they warn against leaping from silence to speculation. The most orthodox view is simple: the ships either broke apart into smaller vessels and hid in friendly ports, or were taken quietly by rival powers and absorbed into other fleets. In this telling, there is no voyage to China, only a dispersal of resources in the face of sudden ruin. Yet, even among the cautious, there are those who admit the East was not beyond reach. The Mongol Empire still linked Europe to China through the Silk Road and maritime trade routes. Arab and Persian merchants sailed from Hormuz to Chinese ports with regularity, carrying goods that occasionally reached the markets of the Mediterranean. A small, disciplined fleet, they concede, could have made the journey if it had the right charts, provisions, and alliances. It is in the realm of alternative history and speculative research that the theory of a Templar voyage to China truly thrives. Writers in this tradition point to the scattered clues: the unexplained cross in Fujian, the robe with a red-crossed shield in its lining, the coins found in Southeast Asian waters, and see not coincidence, but a pattern. They imagine the fleet sailing south along the African coast, rounding the Horn, entering the Indian Ocean, and slipping into the Great Sea lanes eastward. Some go further still, suggesting that the Templars may have already been laying groundwork for such a voyage before 1307.
They note the order's contacts with Eastern traders in Acre, their use of Arabic navigational instruments, and the tantalizing mention in one inventory of a chart of the Sea of Cathay. In this view, the flight from La Rochelle was not a desperate escape, but the execution of a long prepared plan, a retreat to a predetermined sanctuary. Treasure hunters, for their part, often focus on the cargo such a fleet might have carried. Theories range from the plausible gold, silver, and portable treasures to the mythical the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, secret scrolls from under the Temple Mount. If such relics existed and were indeed transported to China, their fate becomes another mystery within the larger one. Did they remain hidden in some temple storehouse where they melted down, translated, dispersed, or do they still lie in a sealed chamber, waiting for the right seeker to arrive? Some researchers attempt to tie the Templar voyage theory to later European exploration. They point to Portugal's Order of Christ, the direct successor to the Templars in that country, as a possible conduit for Eastern knowledge. Under the red cross of the order, Portuguese ships sailed farther than any before them, eventually reaching India and China in the 16th century. Could the seeds of these voyages have been planted by information brought back by Templars 2 centuries earlier? Even in China, there are occasional nods to the possibility. A handful of Chinese historians, intrigued by the anomalies in coastal archaeology, have explored the idea that unknown European traders may have visited during the late Yuan Dynasty. They note the presence of certain steelworking techniques and shipbuilding elements in southern ports that do not match earlier Chinese traditions, but these observations remain speculative, as the evidence is too fragmentary to draw firm conclusions. Modern technology has added new tools to the search. Satellite imagery, underwater sonar mapping, and digital archives allow researchers to comb coastlines and shipwreck sites with unprecedented detail. Every so often, a discovery, a European coin in an unlikely place, a fragment of armor beneath tropical waters sends a fresh ripple through the community of believers. But each find, no matter how intriguing, stops short of the definitive. In the absence of proof, the debate itself becomes the legacy. On one side are those who demand verifiable evidence, wary of the romance that can cloud historical judgment. On the other are those who believe that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that the very nature of the Templars, their discipline, secrecy, and maritime reach, makes it plausible they could vanish into the east without leaving a clear trace. And somewhere between the two, in the quiet middle ground, are the storytellers.
They care less about proving the voyage than about imagining it, about the feel of the wind in the sails, the glint of a cross hidden beneath a robe, the sight of a white mantled figure stepping ashore in a foreign harbor as the sun rises over the South China Sea. For them, the Templar voyage to China is not a claim, but a question, one that keeps history alive in the realm of wonder. Perhaps this is why the theory persists. It is not only about the Templars, it is about the human urge to believe that the past holds more than we have been told, that the straight lines in our history books hide deeper, older currents. Whether those currents lead to a Chinese harbor in the year 1310 or only to the shores of our imagination, the voyage is worth taking.
EMA. For even now, more than 7 centuries after the fleet slipped from La Rochelle, the image remains vivid sails swelling in the wind, a horizon unbroken by land, and somewhere beyond it, a shore that waits in silence, a shore where the Red Cross might once have flown, unseen, beneath a foreign scupola. Stone holds memories longer than parchment, in the salt-stained walls of port, in the carved lintels of temples, in the quiet corners of archives where ink has faded to a ghostly brown. There are traces that seem to speak in a language older than the sea's forgetting. One such trace lies in Quanzhou, a great port of the Yuan Dynasty. In the courtyard of a small maritime museum stands a weathered gravestone, its inscription partly worn away by centuries of rain. The script is Latin rare in China, and though much is illegible, one fragment remains Frater, Milites, Anno Domini, brother, soldiers, in the year of our Lord.
Above the inscription is an equal armed cross, its limbs flaring gently at the ends. Some scholars believe it marks the resting place of a Nestorian Christian merchant from the West. Others, more daringly, see it as the grave of a Templar who never returned to Europe. 1,000 miles to the south, on Hainan Island, divers exploring a submerged reef found the remains of a wooden hull, its timbers preserved by the sand. The ship's construction is unusual, neither fully Chinese nor fully like the Arab dhows common in the region. Most striking is a small bronze fitting recovered from the wreck, a circular mount engraved with a cross pate. Laboratory tests date the wood and fittings to the late 13th or early 14th century. The find has yet to be fully excavated, and skeptics caution against drawing conclusions. But the idea that a Western vessel might have met its end in those guaras stirs the imagination. In a monastery library in Fuzhou, an unassuming scroll lies in a cabinet rarely opened. Its text, written in elegant classical Chinese, describes the arrival of foreign traders of the western seas during the reign of Emperor Renzong of Yuan. It notes their hair of gold and eyes like the deep sky, their robes of white lined with red, and their offering of fine wine in silver vessels. The scroll names no country, no order, but the color of their robes, the gift of wine, and the presence of silver all fit with what we know of the Templars' possessions. An even more puzzling find emerged in 20th century India, in the coastal city of Kozhikode, Calicut. Among the archives of an old trading guild was a vellum-bound ledger, likely copied from an earlier original, that includes a drawing of a flag, a white field with a red cross pate. The accompanying notes describe it as the banner of seafaring Franks who visited on their way to the Eastern Ocean in the early years of the 14th century. The ledger records that they purchased pepper, ginger, and rice before departing eastward with the monsoon. In Europe, too, there are tantalizing fragments. In the archives of the Order of Christ in Portugal, a bundle of maps and charts from the 15th century contains one sheet drawn in an older hand. It depicts part of the South China coast, labeled with names not found in any known Portuguese record before the voyages of the 1500s. In one corner, faint but visible, is a tiny red cross. Was it a later addition, or was it copied from a chart brought back long before Portugal officially reached those shores? Some of the most debated evidence is not an object, but a text. A strange Isan brief mention in the Chronicon Lusitanum, a Portuguese chronicle compiled in the 14th century. Among its accounts of local events is a passing note, and in those days, ships of the temple were not seen again, and it is said they sailed beyond the lands of the Moors to seek a new Jerusalem in the east. The chronicler offers no source, no detail, only the sentence, like a pebble dropped into deep water. Even more enigmatic are the carvings in a coastal cave near Beihai on the Gulf of Tonkin. Local fishermen have known the cave for generations, but only recently have archaeologists examined its walls closely. Amidst the mix of Chinese characters and old seafarers' marks is a set of Latin letters, deeply cut but smoothed by age. Deus vult, God wills it. Below them is an equal-armed cross, its edges sharp despite the centuries. How such a carving came to be there is a question with no agreed answer. Skeptics argue that each of these finds can be explained without invoking the Templars. The cross pate, after all, is not exclusively theirs. Latin inscriptions could belong to other European traders or missionaries. Ship fittings travel far through trade, and they are right to caution against the seduction of seeing what we want to see. But there is a pattern here. If one is willing to trace it with a patient hand, the gravestone in Quanzhou, the wreck off Hainan, the Fuzhou scroll, the Calicut ledger, the chart in Portugal, the chronicles passing line, the carving in the cave, none alone is proof. Together, they are like fragments of a shattered mirror reflecting, in pieces, the possibility of a story that has yet to be fully told. If these are the fingerprints of a Templar voyage, they suggest not conquest, but adaptation. No fortress or crusade, only the quiet embedding of a few foreign brothers into the fabric of a distant land. They traded, they learned, they perhaps prayed in secret, and in the folds of their new lives, they may have hidden the treasures material and spiritual that they had carried from a Europe that no longer welcomed them. The sea covers more than it reveals. Sand swallows ships, paper decays, but sometimes a fragment endures enough to remind us that history is never as complete as we believe. And so, in the measured light of museums and in the deep shade of temple courtyards, we can still find these echoes, objects, and texts that might, just might, be the footprints of knights who refused to let their story end where their enemies decreed it should. The centuries between the vanished fleet and today have not erased the idea that the Templars may have walked on Chinese shores. If anything, the passing of time has sharpened the outline of the mystery, turning it from a matter of simple history into something more enduring, a living thread woven through culture, tourism, and the shared imagination of two distant worlds. In southern China's Fujian province, the temple with the strange cross still stands. The carving above the alcove is weathered now, the stone darkened by rain, but its shape still arrests the eye. Tourists come, some guided by scholarly curiosity, others by the thrill of standing before something that might, just might, be a mark left by a medieval order from half a world away. The temple's caretakers speak of the carving with measured words, careful not to claim what cannot be proved, yet aware that its mystery draws visitors as surely as incense draws the faithful. In Quanzhou's Maritime Museum, the gravestone with the Latin inscription is displayed in a quiet hall. School children pass it on field trips, listening as guides explain its possible origins, perhaps Nestorian, perhaps merchant, perhaps something else. The plaque does not mention the Templars by name, but the museum gift shop sells small brass pendants shaped like the cross pate, a subtle nod to the story that lingers in the air, half a world away. In Europe, the connection is more openly embraced. In Portugal, The Order of Christ, the successor to the Templars, has become part of national heritage. Tours of the Convent of Christ in Tomar speak not only of the order's role in Portugal's age of exploration, but also, in hushed tones, of the possibility that their knowledge of far seas came from earlier, secret voyages. Local cafes sell Templar tea, a blend said to be inspired by Chinese leaves, a playful fusion of fact and legend. In Scotland, where Templar myths are already woven into the national fabric, small historical societies host talks on the Eastern Journey, exploring how the fleet's disappearance might connect to Chinese ports. They project images of the Fujian cross, the Quanzhou gravestone, and the Calicut ledger onto the walls of village halls, sparking debate among locals and visitors alike. For modern researchers, the connection to the present is not only cultural, but technological. Digital archives now allow Chinese maritime records and European chronicles to be compared in ways impossible even a generation ago. Scholars in Beijing and Lisbon exchange scanned pages, hunting for matches in trade manifests, coastal defense logs, and ship registries every so often. A phrase emerges: foreign traders in white, wine and silver vessels, cross-marked flag that rekindles the question. Tourism boards in parts of China have quietly recognized the draw of the mystery. In some coastal towns, walking tours lead visitors past old warehouses, wells, and harbor walls, pointing out architectural details that might be influenced by Western builders. While no claim is made outright, the suggestion is left hanging, an invitation for the visitor's imagination to supply the rest. Writers and filmmakers, too, have seized on the legend. In Chinese historical dramas, a pale-faced foreigner will sometimes appear at a port, offering strange goods and speaking a halting mix of languages. In European novels, a weathered map with Chinese characters will be discovered in a Templar chest. Even video games set in the medieval period have begun to weave in the possibility of an Eastern chapter to the Order's story, letting players sail from La Rochelle to distant dragon-guarded harbors. For some, the connection to the present is deeply personal. In a fishing village on Hainan Island, an elderly man keeps a rusted iron nail in a carved wooden box. He says it came from a shipwreck long before his time, and that his grandfather told him it was made by men who came from the far west. Whether or not it is truly Temlar, it has become a family treasure, a talisman linking them to a wider world. In this way, the legend has become a bridge. It connects East and West not through proof, but through the shared joy of wondering. The historian, the traveler, the child in a museum all stand before the same question: could it be true? And in that shared space of uncertainty, cultures touch without conquest, without command. The Templars' possible voyage to China has also become a metaphor for persistence. In lectures and essays, scholars use it to illustrate how ideas, like ships, can outlast the storms that scatter them. Even if the fleet never reached the East, the notion that it could have speaks to a truth about human ambition: that even in the face of annihilation, there is always a horizon worth chasing. And so, the connection to the present is not only in stone carvings or archival scraps, it is in the way the story continues to be told, retold, and reshaped.
It lives in the cautious words of the guide in Quanzhou, the proud nod of the historian in Tomar, the speculative grin of the amateur sleuth scrolling through old maps online. 7 centuries have passed since the fleet vanished, and still, somewhere between the salt air of China's southern ports and the Atlantic winds of La Rochelle, the sails of that imagined journey billow in the minds of those who dare to picture it. For all the stories told, for all the stones examined and scrolls unrolled, the sea between La Rochelle and the shores of China remains dark with uncertainty. It is a darkness not of absence, but of possibility, a place where questions drift like phantom ships, their sails full, yet their destinations unknown. The first question is the simplest, Timon, and the most elusive: did they go at all? The silence of the records after October 13th, 1307, is both a wall and a window. It could mean that the fleet was seized, scattered, and absorbed into other powers without fanfare, or it could mean that the Templars truly slipped away beyond the reach of France and Rome, beyond even the maps of their age, without a single definitive artifact linking them to an eastern shore. The answer remains suspended, a coin spinning in the air, never settling on either side. If they did go, then the second question follows: why China? The east was not the only direction open to them. Scotland, Portugal, and the Levant all offered havens of a sort. To choose China would require purpose, perhaps the lure of wealth from silk and spice, perhaps the promise of safety under a distant empire, perhaps even the vision of building a new Jerusalem far from the battlegrounds of the Holy Land. Was it trade, exile, or a quest for something sacred that set their course? A third question lingers in the shadows. What did they take with them? Gold and silver. Yes, if they had it, but wealth alone would not explain their secrecy. Some theories speak of relics from under the Temple Mount, guarded for 2 centuries, others of forbidden manuscripts, maps of uncharted seas, or knowledge of fortification and navigation unknown to their European rivals. If such treasures were carried east, were they traded away for survival, hidden in stone vaults, or quietly woven into the life of their new home? There is also the matter of allies. No voyage of such length could succeed without safe harbors along the way.
Did they have agreements with Arab merchants whose dhows could guide them through the monsoon winds? Did they leave letters of credit or signals in distant ports, instructions for those who would follow? Or did they rely entirely on stealth, sailing as shadows among the crowded sea lanes of the Indian Ocean? And what of their fate in the East if the Templars reached Chinese shores? Did they remain as a distinct brotherhood, holding to their vows and rituals in secret? Or did they dissolve into the tide of foreign traders, their red crosses tucked away, their prayers spoken silently in the privacy of a rented room? Perhaps the order survived in spirit only, its structure melting into the life of a land that knew nothing of its quarrels with European kings. Some questions stretch beyond the realm of probability into the territory of dream. Could a fragment of their knowledge, a chart, a ship design, a method of coastal defense have filtered back to Europe through the centuries, hidden in the hands of Portuguese navigators or Arab pilots? Could it be that the age of exploration, when Europe finally reached China by sea in the 16th century, was in some small way shaped by the footprints of those who had come before? Unseen, then there are the echoes, the strange survivals that may be nothing or everything, the cross carved above a temple gate in Fujian, the grave in Quanzhou with its flaring armed emblem, the Hainan shipwreck and its bronze fitting, the Fuzhou scroll with its pale-faced visitors. None of these prove the journey, yet together they form a pattern in the mist, like the constellation a sailor traces that chase in the night sky, not because the stars are joined, but because the mind longs to join them. Perhaps that is the final question. Do we search for truth or for the story? For some, proof is everything. Without a signed logbook or a relic that can be traced without doubt, the theory is nothing more than a romance. For others, the beauty of the mystery is that it resists proof, that it lives in the space between fact and imagination, a place where the mind can sail free. And so the questions remain, carried on the wind that has blown across the centuries. Did the white-mantled knights truly watch the sunrise over the South China Sea? Did they pray in the shadow of dragon-carved gates? Did their ships heavy with secrets ever anchor in the harbors of the Yuan Dynasty? The answers, if they exist, lie buried in the sea's bed, in the dust of archives, or in the fading memory of a story told long ago. But until they are found, or until the last curious mind stops asking, the Templar's eastern voyage will remain what it has always been: a horizon that calls, a sail glimpsed in the distance, and an echo that lingers long after the oars have stilled. Engineering the Templar ships, their sails bleached by salt and sun, slipping through the mouth of the Pearl River as the first light spills over the horizon. The air here is softer than the Atlantic winds they once knew warm, heavy with the mingled scents of salt water, jasmine, and wood smoke from cooking fires hidden among the palms. The cries of seabirds are sharper, more insistent, and somewhere on the bank, a bell tolls in a tone unlike any church chime in Europe. The river widens into a harbor flanked by mountains, their slopes veiled in morning mist. The peaks rise like watchful sentinels, their outlines softened by the pale gold of the dawn. Fishing boats glide silently between the anchored junk. their sails shaped like the folded wings of some great seabird. The hulls are painted in faded reds and blues, their decks fragrant with drying nets and baskets of silver-scaled fish. Here, the light itself feels different.
It filters through the haze in muted tones, painting the world in soft greens and nines and amber. The Templars, who have spent years under the harsh clarity of the Mediterranean sun, must have felt as though they had sailed not just to another land, but into another palette of creation. As they step ashore, the ground beneath their boots is packed earth, worn smooth by generations of traders. The streets are narrow and winding, their edges lined with stalls shaded by silk awnings. The air is alive with the scent of spices, cinnamon, and star anise, mingling with the sharp tang of ginger. Somewhere nearby, a pot of tea steams, its fragrance curling upward in the warm air. Beyond the harbor lies the walled city, its gates carved with dragons whose scales catch the light in 1,000 tiny glints. The walls are high, their bricks the color of deep river clay, and at intervals along the top, guards move with measured steps, their lamellar armor catching the sun. The city hums with a rhythm the Templars have never known, the calls of market sellers, the creak of wooden carts, the distant music of a stringed instrument whose notes rise and fall like waves on a gentle tide. In the countryside beyond, the land stretches into patterns of green and gold. Terraced fields climb the hillsides, each level reflecting the sky in mirrored pools. Farmers in wide brimmed hats move among the rice plants, their silhouettes small against the vastness of the earth and sky. Bamboo groves whisper in the wind, their slender trunks swaying in unison, and in the distance the silver thread of a river winds toward the horizon. The Templars, used to the stone fortresses and narrow fields of Europe, must have been struck by the abundance here not only of goods, but of life itself. Orchards heavy with lychees and citrus, gardens bursting with chrysanthemums, streams alive with darting fish.
Even the air seems thicker with growth, as though the land breathes more deeply than the arid coasts of the Levant or the rocky shores of the Atlantic. Traveling inland, they would find temples rising from the hillsides, their roofs curling upward like the tips of waves, each tile glazed in colors that shift with the light. Incense drifts from their open doors, carrying with it a scent at once earthy and sweet. Monks move in silent procession, their robes the color of saffron and deep maroon, their chants rolling like a low tide through the stillness. Perhaps, in quiet moments, a Templar standing in the courtyard of such a temple would feel a curious familiarity, not in the forms or the gods, but in the stillness itself. For in their own chapels, far away in France or Cyprus, they too had known the hush of stone walls, the soft echo of footsteps on worn floors, the sense of being in a place shaped by centuries of devotion. By night, the enchanted landscape changes again.
Lanterns sway in the wind along the waterfront, their light painting ripples of gold across the black water. The air cools and the sounds of the city soften to murmurs, the whisper of waves against the quay, the distant call of a night bird, the soft clink of ceramic cups in a tea house by the shore. Above it all, the stars scatter themselves across the sky not in the patterns the Templars learned to name in Europe, but in constellations unfamiliar, strange and beautiful. Here, under a foreign sky, the knights might stand together on the deck of their ship, the scent of the harbor in their lungs, the murmur of an unknown language on the breeze, and wonder if this was the place where their long flight would end not with battle or betrayal, but with the quiet anchoring of their lives in a land that had no reason to fear them. For in such a place, the past would seem far away, carried off by the days that had brought them here.
And the landscape luminous, fragrant, alive would hold them, as if the world itself had conspired to hide them in beauty. Legends travel as easily as ships, crossing oceans and centuries to find harbors in unfamiliar cultures. The story of the Templar fleet that vanished into the mists of history belongs to a family of tales that span the world, stories of those who are driven from their homes and yet find a way to endure, reappearing in strange lands under new skies. In the West, one of the closest kin to the Templar tale is the legend of Prester John, a Christian king said to rule a vast and hidden kingdom somewhere beyond the known world. For centuries, Europeans imagined him as a ruler of immense wealth and wisdom, who might one day ally with them against their enemies. The location of his kingdom shifted over time, first in India, then in Africa, then somewhere deep in Asia. But the yearning behind the legend was constant, that somewhere far away, a powerful friend awaited, ready to offer refuge or aid to those who believed the Templars sailed east. China could have been their Prester John, a distant realm where survival and secrecy were possible. In the east, there are echoes too. Chinese history tells of the voyages of the monk Jianjin, who in the 8th century braved repeated shipwrecks and hardship to reach Japan, carrying with him not only Buddhist scriptures, but skills in architecture, medicine, and art. His journey, like the Templars' imagined one, was not conquest, but a transfer of knowledge, a crossing that changed both the traveler and the land he entered. There is also the story of Shu Fu, the court sorcerer of the Qin dynasty, sent east by the first emperor in search of the elixir of immortality. According to legend, he sailed with a fleet of ships, never to return. Some say he found a new land and settled there, others that he was swallowed by the sea. In him, we see the same motif as the Templars, a departure into the unknown, the loss of all contact, and the persistence of the mystery. From the Islamic world comes the tale of the Sea of Darkness, the Atlantic, as imagined by Arab geographers, where ships could vanish beyond the horizon into realms of wonder or peril. Among these accounts are stories of sailors who returned with strange goods and stranger stories, their origins hidden. The Templars' fleet could be seen as a mirror to these mariners not setting out to explore, but to escape, and in that escape, becoming part of the sea zone mythology. Even in European folk tradition, there are smaller, humbler parallels: fishermen who rowed out one morning and never returned, monks who set adrift in chronicles to seek God's will, soldiers who vanished after battle and were later said to live in far off lands under new names. These are the human scale versions of the Templar legend, reminders that disappearance is not only for kings and knights, but for anyone who dares to cross the edge of the known. Perhaps the most striking parallel lies in the Polynesian migrations, centuries before the Templars. Polynesian navigators set sail across thousands of miles of open ocean, guided only by the stars, the wind, and the flight of birds. They carried with them the seeds of their culture crops, tools, rituals, and planted them on islands scattered like jewels in the Pacific. If the Templars did reach China, they too would have carried the seeds of their own world, their faith, their symbols, their way of building and trading.
And like the Polynesians, they might have adapted these seeds to new soil, letting them take root in quiet, altered forms. What these parallel legends share is a certain duality. They are both tales of loss and of survival. The home is left behind, perhaps forever, and yet something of it endures in memory, in practice, in the faint marks left on a distant shore. In each case, the truth is blurred by time, but the outline remains departure, disappearance, and the lingering sense that somewhere the journey still goes on. For the Templar voyage to China, these parallels do more than offer context. They give it a place in the great map of human storytelling. It is not alone in its shape. It sits beside the journeys of monks and kings, of sorcerers and sailors, of whole peoples crossing the sea to begin again, and perhaps that is why the Templar legend resonates so deeply. It is, at its heart, a story about endurance in the face of exile, about finding a way to exist when the world you knew has closed its gates. In this, it belongs to everyone, for we have all, in some way, been carried by life into strange waters, wondering what shores we might call home. From time to time, history seems to breathe, exhaling some small fragment of the past into the present. These moments are not full revelations, but glimmers like the brief flash of a fish deep beneath the surface, enough to make you wonder what else swims unseen. One such glimmer came in '98 when construction workers in Guangzhou unearthed a cache of old ceramics beneath the foundation of a warehouse. Among the shards was a single piece of pottery, unremarkable in shape, but bearing a painted design of an equal armed cross in deep red glaze. Local historians called it a merchant's mark, perhaps from a foreign trader. But some could not help noting the uncanny resemblance to the cross pate worn by the Templars. A decade later, in 2008, a diver exploring a reef off the coast of Hainan recovered a small bronze medallion, corroded but still legible. Its front bore the faint image of a knight's helmet above a cross. The back was blank, except for a few scratches that some claimed were Latin letters. Laboratory analysis dated the alloy to a range that included the early 14th century. The find was quietly cataloged and placed in storage, its origin unresolved. In 2014, a researcher in Lisbon working through digital scans of Portuguese archives stumbled upon a forgotten letter. It was addressed to the Master of the Order of Christ, the successor to the Templars in Portugal, and dated to 1523. The writer, an unnamed captain returning from China, spoke of finding marks of the cross of the temple carved in a stone wall near a coastal shrine. The letter gave no further detail, and there was no follow up recorded, but the phrasing was enough to send ripples through the small community of Templar historians. Sometimes the trace is not an object, but a story reawakened. In a fishing village on the Gulf of Tonkin, an elderly woman told visiting anthropologists of the pale warriors who had once come to trade. Her version was different from others collected in the region, more specific in its imagery. She spoke of shields with flowers of red and ships with wings like birds. The anthropologists could not decide whether she had inherited an authentic oral tradition or had absorbed details from outside stories. Still, the precision of her words was unsettling, like a thread woven from a fabric that had long since frayed. Even modern archaeology has its near misses. In 2019, a joint Chinese European expedition surveyed a cluster of shipwrecks in the South China Sea. Most were unmistakably Chinese junks, but one wreck had structural features that did not match known regional ship types. A fragment of a metal fitting bore a pattern of flared arms, though corrosion made its exact form uncertain. The expedition report labeled it undetermined. For those inclined to see the Templar cross, the photograph was enough to ignite speculation. The return of the trace is not always material. It can be the sudden resurfacing of an old document in a digital archive, or a small note in a scholar's footnote that sends curious readers chasing down obscure sources. It can be the rediscovery of a forgotten artifact in a museum's storeroom where dust and neglect have hidden it from view for decades. Each time, the pulse quickens. Could this be it? Could this be the missing proof? And yet, as quickly as they appear, these traces recede. The pottery shard is filed away. The medallion remains in its drawer. The wreck lies where it has lain for centuries.
The legend waits. Perhaps that is part of the magic. If all the answers came at once, the story would end, but the intermittent nature of these finds the way they surface and sink again keeps the legend alive in a different way. It becomes a rhythm like the breathing of the sea. The world offers a hint, and we lean closer, listening, waiting for the next exhalation. For the believer, these traces are breadcrumbs on a long forgotten trail. For the skeptic, they are coincidences, their meaning inflated by hope. But for the storyteller, and for anyone who has ever felt the pull of a mystery, they are something more. They are proof that the past is never fully sealed, that somewhere beneath the silt of centuries, the truth still moves, waiting to be touched by light. And so the traces return, now and then, like a ship's sail, glimpsed for a heartbeat on the horizon there, and then gone, leaving only the question echoing in the wind: did they truly come this far? Every story has a final page, but not every mystery needs a final answer. Some are meant to fade like the last embers of a fire, their glow lingering in the mind long after the flames have died. The tale of the Templar fleet and its imagined voyage to the Far East is one of these. If we listen carefully, the sound of it is like the sea at night, a constant, gentle hush, broken now and then by the sigh of a wave. It moves in and out of history, touching the edges of fact before receding into the softer currents of legend. And perhaps that is why it endures, because it never allows itself to be entirely caught. The last breath of the mystery comes in quiet images: a carved cross above a temple gate in Fujian, its edges blurred by centuries of rain. A page in a Portuguese archive, the ink faded, the handwriting unfamiliar, mentioning marks of the cross on a distant shore, a rusted nail in a wooden box in a fisherman's hut, said to have come from a ship that sailed from the west. They are not proofs, not in the way a historian demands. They are whispers, soft, incomplete, yet strangely persistent, and whispers, unlike declarations, can live a very long time. Imagine it, if you will,
The last of the Templars in China, he is no longer young. The sea has taken its toll on his bones, and the humid air makes his armor, if he still has it, too heavy to wear. His brothers are gone, some to trade, some to service in the ports, some perhaps to graves in quiet courtyard far from home. He walks now in the streets of a foreign city, his white mantle long since traded for local cloth, his sword for a merchant's ledger. Yet when he passes the harbor at night, he still feels the pull of the tide, the call of the wind in the rigging.
He wonders if anyone in Europe remembers them, or if their names have been struck from the rolls, their deeds unspoken in the halls where once their banners hung. Perhaps, he thinks, this is how it must be. To survive here is to become invisible, to let the past slip away like sand through open fingers. And so, the order does not end with a battle or a final charge. It ends with men who become something else: traders, shipwrights, interpreters, perhaps even husbands to local women, fathers of children who will never know the weight of a knight's vow. In this way, the Templars disappear not in fire, but in life dissolving into the world they sought to enter. Back in Europe, the absence is filled with other stories: tales of treasure buried in Scotland, of ships in the New World, of secret societies guarding ancient truths. But somewhere on the far side of the world, the truth, if it exists, rests quietly in the soil, in the walls of old buildings, in the unbroken silence of the sea. The last breath of the mystery, then, is not a moment of revelation, but a recognition that some journeys are meant to remain unfinished in our minds. The Templar voyage to China, whether fact or fiction, has become more than a historical question. It is a vessel for our own longing, for the idea that it is possible to begin again even after the world has turned against you. It invites us to imagine that beyond the maps we know, there is always another shore, that the horizon is never the end, only the edge of what we can see. And so, the story rests where it began, on the deck of a ship under a wide, unbroken sky, the sails straining in the wind, the prow cutting toward an unseen land. Somewhere ahead lies a coast where no enemy waits, where the cross on the knights' mantles will mean nothing, where they can walk as strangers and be left in peace. That is the last breath of the mystery, not proof, but possibility. And as long as the sea remains, as long as the wind carries the scent of lands unseen, that possibility will not fade. Night falls on the harbor, and Ondakiwari lies black and still, broken only by the slow drift of a fishing boat returning with its lantern swaying like a golden star. Along the quay, the market stalls have emptied, their awnings rolled, their baskets of spice and silk carried back into shadowed rooms. Somewhere deeper in the city, a temple bell calls across the rooftops, the sound low and lingering, like the echo of a memory too old to name. You walk here alone, the air heavy with the mingled scents of sea salt, incense, and rain on warm stone. The tide is turning, pulling the river's skin back toward the open sea. Beyond the harbor mouth lies darkness, the same darkness that once swallowed a fleet and kept it secret for 7 centuries. If you close your eyes, you might hear it: the creak of a ship's timbers, the slow flap of canvas in a shifting breeze, boots on a deck, their steps measured and sure, as if they belong to men who know exactly where they are going. Perhaps it is only the wind, playing tricks in the rigging of the docked junks, or perhaps just beyond the reach of your sight, a shadowed vessel drifts past, her hull weathered, her sails pale against the night, her crew silent beneath cloaks that hide more than just their faces. No flag flies from her mast, but on the breast of one figure at the prow, the moonlight catches a shape across, its arms flaring gently, as if reaching toward all 4 corners of the earth. In that moment, you feel the centuries collapse. La Rochelle's harbor, the storm-tossed Atlantic, the monsoon-washed waters of the South China Sea, all are the same sea now, flowing through time as easily as it flows between continents. You understand that the story of the Templars is not fixed to one place or even to one truth. It is a current moving beneath the surface of history, surfacing here and there in fragments: a carving, a coin, a name half remembered. The closing whisper is not a word, but a feeling that they are still out there, in some form, carried forward by the very forces that sought to end them, perhaps in the hands of descendants who no longer know their bloodline, perhaps in the vaults of archives whose keepers have never read the old seals, perhaps in the stones of an old key in a faraway port where the tide still washes the same patterns as it did when their ships first arrived. And if they did reach China, if their boots did touch these shores, if their voices did mingle with the hum of the markets, if their prayers rose beneath the curling eaves of a temple, then their journey was not only one of escape, but of transformation. They came as knights, but they remained as something else, witnesses to a world larger than any crusade, keepers of a secret measured not in gold or relics, but in the sheer endurance of their name. The bell sounds again in the distance. The lantern on the fishing boat bobs once more, then vanishes behind a curve in the quay. The harbor grows still. The wind turns, carrying with it the faint tang of open water, and with it the thought that even now, far from here, a ship could be moving quietly toward another horizon, unseen. You open your eyes. The night is only the night. The water is only water. And yet, the air feels different, as if it has just carried a voice past your ear, a voice you cannot quite place, saying nothing you can clearly remember. Only the sense that something has been shared, something small and secret just for you. That is the way of true mysteries. They do not shout their truths. They lean close, they speak softly, and then they are gone, leaving only the echo, the whisper that will follow you long after the harbor has emptied and the tide has gone out. And so the story closes, not with certainty, but with a breath that will not fade, a breath carried on the wind, a breath that smells of salt and far off rains, a breath that says, without words, somewhere, we sailed farther than they will ever know.